Hi everyone. Usually every week I will be posting one of these videos in which I'm going to try to respond to what you wrote in response to the readings and what you wrote in response to the lectures. So this will be our first one. I'll be posting this and as well as some discussion questions for you to respond to for our this week's discussions. So before I get to it, though, I just wanted to make a couple of points. The first point is when you are taking notes, if you are going to take direct quotes from the readings, or if you are going to take direct quotes from the lectures, be sure to use quotes around those direct quotes. So, it needs to have quotes on either side of the notes. And if you are dealing with the readings, then I would also urge you to, after you put the quotations, in parentheses, write down what page you got that from. This is very important because that way, when you come back, let's say when you're writing a paper, our paper, when you come back and you're looking at your notes, you don't mistaken somebody else's words as your own words. Right? So even though your notes aren't, official papers, you are opening yourself up for the chance of plagiarizing without even noticing or unintentionally plagiarizing. So from now on, I will make it a point to tell you, you need to quote if you are using direct quotations. I don't mind you pulling out a quote that you really liked from the readings or to quoting something from the videos, but be sure to use quotation marks. In the readings, be sure to write the page number, because what you don't want is to have to go back to the reading and find out where you got that quote from. Okay, so that's very important. Please do that, not only for this class, for any class that you have. If you are going to take anything directly from another source, put quotations around it when you do, so you don't accidentally plagiarize. The second thing is, so I saw a lot of you did use the opportunity to ask or to put down questions or thoughts at the end of the reading responses and the lecture responses. I hope that you feel free to do that. That is a place for you to ask a question. That is a place for you to say maybe something that you're confused about, or to double check if you understand something correctly, or to make a comment about the readings or the lectures. So that's one of the places in your reading and lecture questions, or in your reading and lecture responses, that I look very closely at, because in these videos that I will be making every week, I make sure to respond to all of the questions that you've posed. Okay? And so I'm going to get to the questions now. In advance, I want to sincerely apologize to you if I mispronounce your name. This is one of the drawbacks of having a fully online class. I don't hear you pronounce your own name. So my sincere apologies for that. That is totally my fault in that sense. So let's get to the reading questions first. So the first question that I've pulled out, I try to organize them in some kind of thematic way. The first question is by Sundus. Sundus asks, one of the questions I have been thinking about is some examples about issues. Whenever I think about any example of issues, it always has something to do with trouble in any way. I just get confused sometimes between them, since issues is always related to trouble at the end. Thank you, Sundus. That's a great observation, actually. And I think in many ways you're right. Every issue in some ways has a corresponding trouble. The opposite might not always be the same, right? Not every trouble is connected to an issue, but for sure every issue is connected to a trouble. And why is that? Look, one of the main things we were talking about in relationship to C. Wright Mills's sociological imagination, and the reason why I had you read it, besides the fact that it's it's a central primary text within sociology, because I want us to understand the interplay between structure and agency, or between structure and the individual, or between how the world is structured and how we either individually or collectively respond to the world. That is the main kind of takeaway from the C. Wright Mills reading, from the notion of the sociological imagination. It's about how do we understand our world, not just as a collection of individual human beings, but also as in a structural way, right? So if you think about it in that way, issues are always structural. Troubles are how we feel problems individually. So troubles is at the individual level, issue is at the structural level. Now, given that, when you think about a structure, structures, social structures, so let's, a structure could be the way that the university is structured. A structure could be how the city of Long Beach is organized, or how a corporation is organized, or the country, how the United States is organized. Or structure could be, how the world is organized into a nation state system. Structures, we could talk about structures at multiple levels. But one thing is for sure, structures are in many ways human creations. Human structures are human creations. So that when structures create problems, right, when there is an issue, with the C. Wright Mills, when he talked about issues, he was trying to get us to think about issues emanate from structures. And if structures create problems, well, who do they create problems for? Right? How are those problems felt? Those problems are always felt at the human level, at the individual level as well. So that any kind of structural issue will at some point somehow have a corresponding trouble. The opposite might not always be as easy as the other way around. So I think one of the reasons why you were having a problem with that is that you're right. Every issue has a corresponding trouble, right? So let's say that, when, one of the examples I often give, and this might not be the case nowadays, but a couple of years ago, during the 2008 financial crisis, one of the things that occurred was budgets to colleges got cut, especially in California. And so what that meant was that colleges cut classes. And so it was very hard for students to, you needed a class to graduate, and that class wasn't being offered consistently. And there was a rush to be able to get into classes, and there wasn't as many classes, so it was hard to get into classes, and that was creating problems for students. The way that students felt it wasn't, the average, student. I was a student back then. The way I felt it wasn't like, oh, California has a budget crisis. They cut college funding, and colleges cut classes. No, the way I felt it was, oh, I have such a hard time picking a class. I can't get this class. I can't get that class. I need to figure out a way how to get first in line when choosing classes, or else all classes are being taken. So I was feeling it as a trouble. I had a personal problem. But when I sat in the class those first days when I was trying to crash all these classes, and I noticed, wow, there's all these other students who are also crashing the same class. They're all trying. So I was like, what is going on that is creating a problem where all of us, a bunch of students, are all having the same individual trouble? And that's when, once I started talking to different students, everybody's like, oh yeah, I can't get a class. All the classes are filled, da 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 da. And then it begins to dawn on me and other students, oh, well, maybe this problem isn't my problem. It's not just that maybe, that I'm doing something wrong, but that there is also a larger structural issue that is forcing all of us to have a similar problem at the same time. Right? So in terms of an example, that is one example of how the structural issue necessarily creates a personal trouble. So I hope that maybe clarifies it a little bit, Sundus. There's a couple of other questions about the same thing, so maybe that we could talk about those and it could be helpful. So the second question I picked out was from Jacob Frank. Jacob asked, one of the questions I had considered was wondering if there could be other questions to consider for the sociological imagination outside of the three that C. Wright Mills asks us to ask ourselves. Are there other things that we as humans should consider when trying to understand how others are in similar circumstances? Another question I had, I was wondering how or when these three questions could be asked during the understanding of the sociological imagination. When should we consider these important questions that we must ask to truly understand others and their circumstances? Right. Great question, Jacob. So for sure. So the first thing that you ask is like, well, are there other kind of essential understandings to human nature, or are there other things that we need to understand in order to understand like the social world? And I think there are, right? We could think about other major questions, or to put it another way, there are for sure other types of ways in which human sociality is structured that must be considered. For example, we could think about, the importance of the way that resources are produced and distributed. So production and distribution could be a central question. We could think of other ones as well. So this is the point for sure, isn't that sociological imagination tells you everything you need to know about how humanity is, how to understand humanity, right? Like I was saying before, the central point of C. Wright Mills' sociological imagination is the interplay between structure and agency. And I talked about this in the lecture. Structure is how, we structure the world around us, the world being on various scales, whether, like I said, whether it's this class, the college, the university, the state of California, the United States, the world, all those are different levels of structures. We could talk about public structures like the government. We could talk about private structures like a corporation, right? So those are the structures. Agency is another word that we could talk about the structures is the objective world, meaning how the objective conditions. By the objective I mean how is the world outside of you organized? On the other side is agency. Agency is the ability to act on the world. It's the ability to act on the objective conditions. It's the ability to act on the world. Agency is how you decide to interact with this class the way that I've structured it. Maybe you all go along with whatever I say. Maybe you're like, you know what, this is a terrible way of organizing the class. I'm going to not take it. I'm going to drop it. That's an ability that you have. Or you're like, you know what, I'm going to talk to my classmates and I'm going to try to get them to go and complain to the chair of the department that Professor Bacher is just not good. He's not, doing his job. Or what. There's different ways you could intervene to ameliorate your problems that might be structural. So that's what I mean by agency. The agency could be at the individual level, me and you, or it could be you and your classmates all together come together to create a new type of agency. It's a collective agency, right? So the main point of the that what I wanted to get out of the short a snippet of the book by C. Wright Mills, the American sociologist, is the interplay between structure and agency, the interplay between us as individuals and how the world operates around us. This is important. I think it's a thing that we miss all the time, especially in the United States, where we think everything could be understood if you examine the individual. And thus we turn a blind eye to the structures, and thus, as the example I was suggesting, we all think that we can't get the class because we did something wrong, and because of that, we miss the fact that there is the state of California was, in the example, right, was not investing in something that might be important to all of us, say education. So that's what what sociological imagination is attempting to get at. It's not a total picture, it's one picture. The importance of the relationship between structure and agency, between how the world is organized and how people at individual or collective level organize in response to how the world is organized, right? So like, I mean, you don't have, just because you're organized into a collective doesn't mean you have to resist it. You could be organized in a collective to support the way that something is organized, right? You could be organized in a collective that supports the government of the United States, or you could be organized in a collective to resist the way that a policy of the United States government is developed, right? So that's what it's attempting to get at. Now, then you ask, when should we ask these questions? How should we when is the appropriate time to do this? From a scholarly perspective, all of us in this class are scholars, right? From a social scientific perspective, all of us here are trying to attempt to understand the social world. I would say you have to be asking that question all the time. So that anytime you look at the social, you have to look at two things at once. You have to look at the individual or the agency, and you have to look at the structure. And in some ways, it's when you try to develop a sociological imagination, is that you're not only looking at them as two distinct things, right? You're looking at them in terms of how they operate together, how they come together, how they're both manifesting themselves at the same time. Because as the individual responds to the world around them changes. And as the world around them changes, so will the individual. So I hope that makes sense, Jacob. Thank you for the question. The next question is from Anna Lee, and Anna asks, how is it possible to form a sociological imagination? Is it enough to just ask the three questions that Mills mentioned? So the questions that Mills asked is an attempt at helping us to be able to decipher the structural and the individual. So it's one way at getting to understand the interplay between the structural and the individual. Is it just enough to just ask these three questions? I mean, I think it's a good start. Because you could ask them and answer them wrong, or you could ask these questions, and by attempting to answer these questions, you might develop other types of sub questions that you might answer. So I think for me, the importance is to be able to develop a focus, a keen understanding, and to be able to have kind of a lens that when you look at the social world, you're able to see the structural and the individual, so that you do not become blind to one or the other, right? Because if you just look at the individual level and you don't look at the structural, then you miss on how everything is organized in a way that even influences every individual to act in a similar fashion. And if you don't pay attention to the structural level, and if you don't pay attention to the individual level, and all you look at is the structural level, what you end up missing is, well, how are people actually responding? Because sometimes people oppose, sometimes people agree, sometimes people are ambivalent, right? And the way that people respond to structures will mean something about the future of those structures. If all of us support the policies of the U.S. government, then the policies of the U.S. government will be implemented the way that they were written. If all of us oppose the policies of the U.S. government, then those policies will have a hard time being implemented. Maybe they will change. If we are ambivalent to all of those policies, then those policies will also then create the things that they wanted to without any, so how we respond to the structures means something about if those structures will actually continue, stop, or be amended or changed in some ways. So it's important to be able to see both of those things. And I think then when we start to do that, we could get to a point in which the sociological imagination, or in other words, being able to see the individual and the structural part together and to see how they interplay with each other and how they interact with each other and how they create each other in some ways, that could start to become a normal part of your analysis of the world. So that when you are looking at the news, the local news, you're able to start asking those questions. Well, what are the structural causes for this happening? Is the rise of police brutality, for example, caused by some kind of structural thing, or is it just bad apples? There's just bad people, cops who were bad who committed police brutality, or is there something about the way that the police are structured in a given city that produces those conditions? You start to be able to ask those questions and to see what, and by doing so, the argument is that you would come to a better understanding of what is actually happening, right? So that is what my response would be. Nicole asks a very interesting question. She says, it's a comment and a question, which I appreciate. She says, are there any real good benefits that come from using sociological imagination? I ask this because I genuinely find this quite problematic, as belittling your own struggles just because other people have it worse is just not healthy. It forces us to feel bad for feeling bad. I would like some examples, if there are any, in which sociological imagination is good for an individual. So thank you. One, thanks for the honesty. Two, thanks for challenging something in the class and for putting it out there. So I really appreciate that, because then it enables us to kind of think through this in a more sophisticated way. So I commend you, and I hope that other folks also feel free to ask challenging questions. So this is what I would say. I think that I don't think the sociological imagination is asking us to belittle our struggles. In other words, it is not saying that just because, if I have a personal trouble and you have a personal trouble, that somehow what I'm feeling, the problems that I have on my daily life, is somehow not worth thinking about, not worth talking about, or is not that important because, that person has it too, or, there is thousands of people that are feeling that way. Just because there are thousands of people feeling the same miserable, let's say this feeling that we're having, this trouble is causing us great pain. Just because everybody's feeling the pain that I'm feeling doesn't mean that my pain is not important or that their pain is not important because there's a bunch of people feeling it. No, I don't think that's what sociological imagination is asking us to do. What it's asking us to do is to say that, well, if there's a bunch of people, if we are able to see that a bunch of people are having the same types of trouble, that might mean that it is not their personal individual faults that they are going through whatever they're going through, that there might also be something larger than them, something structural that is creating the conditions that is making all these people feel the same way or have the same types of problems. So let me give you an example, Nicole. Maybe tell me how you think about this, or what you think about this. Because of the pandemic, there are a lot of people, whether because of the health problems or not, people lost their jobs, people lost money, people find it hard to go to work. They were isolated in their homes. and there was a real uptick in terms of mental health issues, right? Anxiety, depression, feelings of isolation, self-doubt, all kinds of things. And so each person that was having those feelings, those feelings also then brought up a bunch of other things that each individual, because of their own individual life history, had to go through. And so it brought up those things, right? So like, for example, for me, there were moments in which I felt a lot of anxiety. The anxiety that I felt brought up a lot of insecurities I have from my own personal kind of life. And the same thing happened with other people. And so like, that doesn't, so there is definitely something that is very individual to the way that I felt the anxiety caused by the conditions of the pandemic. That was not the same, that was very unique to me. But at the same time, if we sent all of us who were feeling that anxiety to therapists, that I would say would not necessarily solve our problems. That if we each individually worked on our own anxiety, that wouldn't, for example, solve the childcare, the economic conditions, the healthcare conditions that caused those anxieties to bubble up to the surface, right? So that those things would still exist. And let's say I developed all kinds of therapeutic ways of dealing with my anxiety, of meditation, of exercise, better eating, or whatever my therapist would tell me to do. Tomorrow, I still wouldn't have my job, or tomorrow, I still would have to be dealing with some kind of health problems my family had. Tomorrow, I would still have some of these problems that aren't of my own doing, but are structural in some ways, right? So that it's not belittling my issue, my troubles. Those are very important, and I need to figure out a way to deal with them that is also unique to me. But there is no way to resolve this problem at a social level without resolving the structural, right? So I don't think it's to say dealing with the structure is better, dealing with the individual is worse. It's to say that the both are connected, right? So that's why it's important to have a psychologist. Psychologists work at the individual level just as much as it is important to have somebody who is a social worker, because a social worker works at the family neighborhood level just as much as it is important to have a person who has a public policy degree, because then they are working at the city or state level. You need all those different levels to deal with these problems that because they are both individual and structural at the same time. So let me know what you think about that, Nicole. Jade asks, an issue I had problems with being able to fully comprehend is the differences between issues and troubles. I was a bit confused on understanding what exactly the material is and if I interpret it affectively correctly. So hopefully I already answered the question about the difference between issues and trouble. Issues being structural, troubles being individual, right? Troubles are the way that we individually feel structural issues. Now, the second thing you talked about is the difference between the material and the affective. So the one way to think about it is that the material is physical things that you could touch and feel and see. So when we're talking about material things, we could talk about the economy, for example. You could see the economy. You could see money. You could see corporations. You could see what corporations produce. You could see consumers buying those things. We could count those things, right? We could have statistics for them. That's the economy's material. Politics is material in many ways, right? You could see the government, you could see social organizations, you could read how they organize themselves, you could see how they actually, how the Congress works or how a parliament works. Those things are material. We could observe them and write them down. Affect is the realm of feelings, the realm of things that we could see the consequences of, but it's hard to be able to see them, right? Like, I can't see your memory. I can't see how you feel about certain things. But your memory is very important, or how you feel about things is very important, because how you feel about things or how you remember things is the thing that is going to determine how you are going to act on the world. So like, you will do something in the material world. Like, you might go out and buy a car tomorrow because you feel like you could, that the economy is going to be okay and you're going to be able to have a job and you'll be able to pay your loan back. And because you feel that way, whether it's right or wrong, you go and you do something material. So the affective, when I talk about affect, we're talking about all of these things that are not necessarily material, but will for sure have material consequences. Because my contention is that human beings aren't robots. And the reason why we are not robots is because we have feelings. So we don't just do something because of a simple cost-benefit analysis, because of a simple algorithm. We see something strikes a certain kind of, we remember certain things, we feel certain things, and based off of those things, then we interact with them. So that's what I mean by the difference between them. So hopefully that clears up the question. Tandi asks an important question. How do we make the masses more informed so they don't limit themselves? How do we get people to acknowledge being citizens of the world? Tandi, it's a great question. I don't know if there is a particular answer to this. There are various different theories about how you do that. So I think it's a conversation that we could have, and maybe this could be a discussion questions that people could respond to, or this could be something that we could kind of take up in office hours if you're interested. What I would say, though, is that in our class, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why the so-called masses see things in certain ways and not other ways. So, for example, we'll be talking about the question of nationalism. In it, I will make some points about, well, why is it that people identify as being part of a certain nation as opposed to seeing how they actually have a lot more in common with people outside in a different country than they do maybe with somebody in their own country? So why is there the way that they relate to each other constrained by the borders of the world? So we're going to kind of touch on this issue, but we might not be able to specifically answer. So we're going to find out maybe some reasons of why these limitations exist on people's understanding. And I think, Tandi, this is also why sociological imagination is important, because part of the way that masses are informed in a certain way is that the way we learn about the world itself is structured, right? So we all went to schools, whether it's in this country or another country. Every country in the modern world has a schooling system, and one of the things that every government in every country attempts to do through their schooling system is to give you a certain way of understanding yourself, your country, and the world that enables that government to be in power and do what it wants to do. So that in some ways, from the very beginning, we are, structured to feel or to think a certain way. So something to think about. I'm going to pronounce it as Jure. I'm very sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. My sincere apologies. If you want, if you could send me a note or a little voice memo about how to pronounce your name, I would actually appreciate it. So the question you asked is a question I had was, who are the people mentioned other than Karl Marx in the reading, and how did they apply sociological imagination? So let's go to the quote I think that you're talking about. And I think, Jure, you're talking about this piece of the reading where C. Wright Mills says, we could read it together. The sociological imagination enables us to grasp history and biography and the relationship between the two within a society, right? So he's taught history and biography. Biography meaning your individual level, and history meaning how human societies have changed over time. That is the task and its promise. To recognize this task and this promise is the mark of a classic social analyst. So he's saying if you're really going to be good at analyzing human societies, you need to figure out how to understand the individual and history at the same time. How do you understand your life in the context of the progress of, or how do you understand your life within the context of how entire humanity is moving historically? And then he says, to make his point, he says it is characteristic of Herbert Spencer, turgid, polysyllabic, comprehensive, of E.A. Ross, graceful, muckraking, upright, of Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim, of the intricate and subtle Karl Mannheim. It is the equality of all that is intellectually excellent in Karl Marx. It is the clue to Thorstein Veblen's brilliant and ironic insight, to Joseph Schumpeter's many-sided construction, blah, blah, Max Weber, and is the signal of what is in the best contemporary studies of man and society. Look, so what he's doing here is he's saying, and he's naming a bunch of people that don't necessarily agree with each other. So, for example, Joseph Schumpeter, who is this other thinker, at least the stuff I know of him is this idea, he talks about the problems with democracy and capitalism, how you bring them together. He's not necessarily a big fan of democracy, even though he's a big fan of capitalism. He doesn't necessarily get along with Karl Marx. I mean, these guys aren't necessarily, scholarly buddies. Or Emile Durkheim. Emile Durkheim is what is called a functionalist. Him and Marx wouldn't necessarily get along. Emile Durkheim and Schumpeter would disagree on things. Basically, what he's doing in this text, we don't need to go into what each one is saying, but what he's attempting to say is like, look, here's some great thinkers at the time that he's writing about it, or people he thinks are great thinkers. And all of these great thinkers, despite the fact that they're touching on different parts, different things, and they might even disagree with each other, what makes them great and what makes it what is best in contemporary studies of man and society is the fact that they use the sociological imagination. And by that, as we've been talking about, that is because they are able to look at both the structure and agency at the same time, and they develop some kind of a theory based off of that, or that their explanation of the world is based on an acute observation of how the individual and the social structures interact with each other, the history of that interaction, and what the implications of that interaction is, right? The third question of who's the winner and loser is about power. How is society structured, and given the structure of that society, who has power within society and who doesn't have power within that society? I hope that makes sense. Christina then asks, is the time period of such earthquakes of change over, or is society still advancing at the same intense speed as Mills references here? Great question, Christina. I'll leave it up to you to answer that, and you and others. My personal take would be that I think, it is at we are moving at the same rate as we used to be moving when C. Wright Mills writes the sociological imagination, if not faster. Our world is changing because of the technological development and advances in the ability of capitalism to produce and innovate in terms of profit accumulation. So we're moving really fast. So I think the earthquakes of change are still here with us. But that's my take. Ismail asks, I think the main question would be what exactly determines a society in order for us to perform sociological imagination in regard to it. What if it is a small society, or a society that is in its infancy and has no history whatsoever? What exactly sets the ground for a society to really be considered a society in the first place? Great question. I think for our purposes, society is a short word for a collective, a human collective, something beyond an individual. And that society could be different. Sometimes societies, as scholars, sometimes we develop our own definitions when we are analyzing it. So we could say, for example, I'm going to study the American society. Or sometimes we kind of we zoom in, and so we say, oh well, what I really want to focus on is Long Beach, because people in Long Beach really feel particularly tied to each other in a sense of community. So maybe that could be how you define society, meaning that society is a collection of individuals that is, and they come together. Now we could look at that society at different levels of analysis, right? You could zoom in or zoom out. The humanity is a society. Each country could be defined as a society or less. We could come and define what is the level we're looking at, and then use that to do our analysis. The other thing that could happen is we could say, well, we're going to study societies that think of themselves as societies, as opposed to societies that are societies, but people don't think of themselves in that society. So in that example, for example, you would say, oh, well, the world is a society, like the entire world and all of its population. We need to think about that as a human society. But people of the world don't think of themselves as being in one society. They think of themselves as being part of different collectives. So that is one example in which where you could, as an analyst, define that's a society, but the people themselves in that society don't think of themselves to be part of that society. In which case you ask Tandi's question of well, why is it that people don't believe in themselves or identify with that society? Or you could say, well, I want to only focus on societies that people actually identify with. So, then you could say, well, do Americans see themselves as one society? And, if they do, then that's what I would study. So I think it's a great question that you asked. It's a question that I think from our scholarly perspective, we would have to define when we, at the beginning of our analysis of well, why is it that we're going to zoom at this level, and why are we picking this as opposed to that? Okay, so these were some of the reading responses that I saw and I picked out. So I hope that this answers some of the questions that folks have had. I'm happy to check out your follow-ups. Let's move on now to lecture responses, or the responses that you've had to the lecture, or to the various videos actually that I gave you. So the first one is by Christina Clemens Manzano, and Christina says, I didn't understand the question of the relationship between the subject and the object. So I talked about this a little bit before, but simply the subject is the person or the group of persons. So it's the person or the collective of people who are the actors in whatever example that you're using. They are the ones doing something. Whereas the object is the context in which they are acting, is the thing they are acting on, is the thing they are acting within, is the thing that they are acting against, is the thing that they're acting on behalf of. Object is the world around them that they're attempting to act on. So the subject, just think about a sentence. The subject acts, and the object is the thing that the subject acts on. So from a social scientific perspective, the subject is the agent, the object is the structure. Now, the object could be a lot of different things. Like I said, the structure could be a lot of different things. The objective conditions could be the family. The objective condition could be the neighborhood. It could be this class. It could be the state of California. It could be, there's different levels. And the subject could be an individual, or it could be an entity that's much larger than one individual. So a subject could be a social movement. So for example, the Black Lives Matter movement that we saw over the past year, that is we could talk about that, analyze that as a subject, right? They are attempting, they organize themselves in some ways, and they're acting on the world, or anything else, like any social movement. So the folks that stormed the Capitol, the Trump supporters that stormed the Capitol, you could talk about them as a subject, and then dealing with objective conditions. So that's the distinction. It's between the those who are agents and or acting on the world, and what that world is, right? Or what is that context that they're responding to. Jade asks, I had trouble understanding what an ampliative argument and a deductive argument are. The topic of validity also confused me, and I wasn't sure if my answer was correct or not. So, look, let me maybe simplify it in different ways. A deductive argument starts with theory. So a deductive argument lays out a theory and then goes out into the world to see if that theory applies. And so a deductive argument will always say that if this theory is right, then this thing will always happen. An inductive argument or an ampliative argument, I think an inductive argument is maybe better to say. An inductive argument starts from the world and attempts to create some kind of a theory, or it starts from the world and attempts to see, well, what are the patterns, trends, and maybe we could talk about certain patterns and trends holding across. So a deductive argument starts with theory and then goes into the world. An inductive argument starts with the world and attempts to create a theory. The difference, though, is whereas a deductive argument will say, if this theory is correct, then it applies all the time. An inductive argument says, based on our examination of the world, we could say that this will probably happen most of the time. In other words, an inductive argument doesn't guarantee you an answer, whereas a deductive argument guarantees you an answer. It doesn't mean one is better than the other. They are two different types of arguments. And because there are two different types of arguments, then you have to deal with them or in different ways. So for example, for a deductive argument, if you find one case in which the theory doesn't apply, then there is a problem with the theory. Whereas for an inductive argument, if you find one place where the theory doesn't apply, that doesn't mean the theory is wrong. Because in an inductive argument, it doesn't guarantee you a conclusion. It says the conclusion is probable. So I'll talk about the concept of validity, but I'm gonna see what Paloma has to say, because I think what Paloma has to say is also about validity. So Paloma says, one concept I had a hard time understanding is how a valid argument is considered valid even when the premises are false. Excuse me. I understand that it was because although they were false, it still followed into the conclusion, but it was just a bit hard for me to grasp the concept. Great. So let's say it maybe another way, and maybe this would be helpful. If not, please let me know so I could explain it more. So the question of validity, the validity and soundness are attempting to do two different things. The test of validity, or what we want to do by validity, is to simply say, is the logic correct? Is the way you're thinking about something correct? We're not saying whether the thing you're thinking is right or wrong, but the way that you arrived at the conclusion, is that correct or not? Whereas the test of soundness is, well, let's actually see what you're saying. Besides, like, okay, yeah, this makes sense logically, but is it actually true in the world? So that's the distinction. Validity The test of validity has nothing to do with whether the evidence you're providing is true or false. It's just saying, I'm going to first assume the evidence you provided is true. I'm going to assume the statistics that you have for me are right, that you collected the statistics correctly, the math was right, and the statistics are true. Let's just believe that for a second. If we believe that to be true, does the evidence that you provide, does it support the conclusion? Or are you picking random evidence that has nothing to do with the conclusion? So the validity just wants to know if the premises are true, if your evidence is right, does it follow then that the conclusion is right? Does it match the conclusion? We do that, like to do that, you don't need to know anything about the subject itself. You don't need to know anything about the evidence. You don't need to know anything about the statistics. Like you don't need to know how the survey was collected or anything. You're just looking like, well, does the thinking follow? Does the thinking make sense? Is the evidence laid out in a way that it adds to each other and the conclusion arrives from the evidence? So the test of validity is sometimes, anybody could do it without being an expert in that field. That's the power of understanding logic and understanding being able to, the critical thinking. Critical thinking in that sense, when it comes to validity, means you don't have to be an expert in the subject at all. You just want to, even if you're not an expert in the subject, you could still see if the argument is right. Now, what you need to be an expert on is to then, once you get past that point, so once you're like, okay, you know what? The thinking, the logic is correct. There's nothing wrong with the thinking per se, but now we got to actually look at the evidence. Now, to look at the evidence, then you do need some expertise, right? You do need to figure out, well, was the survey collected correctly? You might need to know something about statistics to be able to see the statistical models they used. You need to have some kind of expertise to be able to say, well, is the evidence correct or is the evidence wrong? So that's the difference. You could always do the test of validity. At that point, then you go into a test of soundness where you actually could check for the evidence that's provided, and that might be a bit more difficult in many ways than the test of validity, which could be simpler, and it could be the first thing you go to. So tell me if that made sense or not, Paloma. If it didn't, I'll try to explain it again. Or if it didn't, come to my office hours, which I encourage everybody to do. And you come to my office hours by clicking on the link to sign up for an office hour appointment on Calendly, and you could sign up for as many slots as you want. So Kendall asks, I think I understand most of the concepts, although it's something hard and confusing to figure out what premises are true or what statements are valid or what arguments are sound. So I hope that my answer to Paloma resolved this, but validity has nothing to do with if statements are true or not. Validity has to do with the flow of the logic. Soundness has to do with, are the premises true or not? Okay, so I talked about this enough, so I'm going to move on to Juray's question. Juray asks, in the example, and then the example is premise 1, all fruit is a chair. Premise 2, square is a chair. And conclusion, therefore square is a fruit. Would the answer be that the argument is invalid? P1 makes sense, however, in that P1 makes sense. However, in P2, where it states square is a chair, it does not state all squares are a chair. Therefore, wouldn't this premise fail to be valid, as squares could be something other than a chair, not satisfying the conclusion? If talking about an individual square that is defined as a chair, it would be valid, but in this case, I believe the general argument to be invalid. Okay, so this is a great example of the test of validity or soundness, because if you read it, if you read the premises, we know because, the example is simple, this is not a sound argument, right? Because fruits aren't chairs, square isn't a chair. Like none of this evidence is right. Right? This evidence is not correct. So we know that this argument is not valid. I'm sorry. This argument is not sound for sure. But that's not the point. The point we're trying to do is to see if it's valid or not. So let's deal with the test of validity again here. So let's translate these into something simpler. So P1 is all fruits is a chair. So it says A is B. Premise 2 says square is a chair. So C is B. Conclusion, therefore, square is a fruit. That C is A. Or let me make this different. If A, then B, C is B, C is A. So if you do this, if you look at this, if A, then B, C is B, does that mean that C is also then A? And here, it's invalid, not because, Jure, what you're saying is that the reason why this is not valid is that it should be if C then B, and then but that actually isn't the reason why it's invalid. The reason why it's invalid is because if C is B, it doesn't say anything to us about if it's A, because if A then B is going one way, it doesn't mean it goes the other way too. So all fruits are chairs doesn't mean that all chairs are fruits. Okay? So it's invalid. You're absolutely right. But it's invalid for that reason. So the way that this would be right is, now if on the other hand you had said, if A then B, if B then C, and then you could say, and then P3 is B. I'm sorry, P3 is A, and then the conclusion is A is C. Right? That would then make sense because of the transitive property. If A, then B. If B, then C. And then you have A, well, then you also have then C. So I hope that clears it up a little bit. Okay, thanks, Jure. So the next question is from Jonathan. Jonathan asks, what if we reach a point in society where there are no losers? Would that lead to no more change to society? So great question, Jonathan. The question of losers and winners in C. Wright Mills isn't about, so it's about the question of power. Where the question that what he's saying about the sociological imagination is, one, what are the structures? How is a society structured? Two, how is that structure done historically? Because we can't just look at one point. We have to look at then how it was developed historically. Then the third question is like, who are the winners and losers? Meaning, the way that structure is organized at this current moment, who has power, who doesn't have power, or how is that power divvied up? So you're saying, well, what if you have a society in which there's the least amount of inequality, where power is divvied up equally? Does that mean that society stops changing? And here I would say that the change, the way that human societies are dynamic, or the way that human societies are in constant motion, is not because there is inequality or injustice. That is one maybe reason that motivates change, because people want to have more equality or want more justice. But the reason why it's in a constant change is because the interplay between the subject and the object, between agency and structure, is constantly in motion. So that In other words, you are always acting on the world, right? I mean, because you live in the world, so you act on the world in a certain way. If you agree with everything, you attempt to bolster it the way it is, which then means the world then, and so the way that then you act on the world, you yourself then are also changing as the world is changing. So you act on the world in one way, then the world acts on you, because you are being created constantly. We are being produced constantly by the structures around us. If tomorrow there is, because of the pandemic, we all changed in certain ways. If tomorrow there is a Great Depression, then we all change in certain ways. And then because we change in certain ways, we attempt to reorganize. Because of the pandemic, we are in the process of changing our society around us because we were all affected by the pandemic in certain ways. Now, we don't know what the end result is going to be, how we're going to be different. We're in the process of that transition. But it's because we changed, our conditions changed, we changed, we are now changing the world around us because we changed. And when we change the world around us, then that world around us is going to change us back. And then we change again, and then that world changes, right? The inertia comes not from necessarily inequality, even though that's part of it, but it comes from the fact that human beings are constantly changing. Our physical world around us, the environment is constantly changing. And as we change, and the environment changes, the structures that we build, we are constantly changing that too. And as those structures that we build change, then those structures have an effect on us, and then they change us too. So that we constantly are changing. So that, let's say you had the perfect, let's play the mental exercise of we develop whatever perfect society means to you. We got that. If we had that in starting today, we arrive at the perfect society. Perfect economy, perfect politics, perfect culture, everything that you want, whatever it is that you think is great, we have. That doesn't mean that then that society stops changing. Because then the next day you have to work, and if you think this is the perfect society, the next day you have to work to make sure that that perfect society stays the same. And then the day after that, you have to make sure that that society stays the same, right? That you don't change fundamentally the things that make you perfect. Well, let's say then tomorrow there's an earthquake. Even if you have a perfect society, it doesn't mean you stop earthquakes. Earthquake destroys half the city. Now you have to rebuild the city, but you want to rebuild the city while keeping that perfect society the way it was, maybe. But you can't really keep it the way it was. It's changed, right? One part of the city was destroyed. You have to rebuild that. Do you rebuild it the same way? You might change it a little bit. So that, just because of that, you change a little bit. So that even if you have the perfect society, in your attempt to persevere, in your attempt to make sure that this perfect society is sustained and maintained, that means that there is going to be change. So change is a constant. Human beings are never the same. To believe that human beings stay the same over years and years and years is to be ahistorical, meaning to be blind to history and to just misunderstand humanity. There's no such thing as a group of people that remain the same over the course of the years. I challenge you. There's no such thing. It's like a law, I think, of social sciences. People change. If you believe that people have stayed the same for thousands of years, you have some prejudice operating. You could challenge me on that. In fact, I think part of racist thinking, not to say that anybody here is, just because you believe this, you're racist, but racist thinking always posits the idea that here's a certain people, they never have changed. All Muslims have always been this way. All black folks have always been this way. All whatever, that there is such a thing as these people, and these people have never changed. change is a condition of, or a change is a defining feature, I think, of human societies. So Shania asks us the question. She says, I do not have any questions about the lectures, but I kind of wanted to add in the introduction to the course video where you had explained that in terms of global, we are not a world of who likes to separate people into boxes where some are classified as citizens or not, etc. But I kind of wanted to add that wouldn't stereotypes be one of the reasons why people do that? Those who only know other people from different races based on stereotypes are the types of people that generalize and put people in certain boxes. It was a thought that came to mind while watching the video. You're absolutely right. So the notion of putting people into certain boxes is going to be motivated by all kinds of ways of thinking. One of it is going to be racialized thinking. That when you think of the world in a racialized way, and by racialized I mean where you believe that resources should be divided between people based on some notion of ancestry or some notion of where they come from, that different people deserve different things based off of that. That's racialized thinking in some ways. That's part of it. Sometimes that's what's operating. Other times it's different things are operating. Like nationalism could be that you don't necessarily think in racial terms, but you think this place is for this people and any people who are not those people cannot come here. That Denmark is only for Danish people. That Denmark has always existed. The Danish people have always existed. And if you're not Danish, you can't come here. And you put like a border. That could be one of the reasons. So I definitely agree with you that stereotypes, but I would go beyond stereotypes to say race thinking or racialization could always be a part of the process of granting people access to things or not. But it could also be other things as well. So thank you. I think you're a great observation, Shania. Nolan didn't ask a question, but I picked up on something he was saying. Nolan said that I wanted to respond to. So Nolan said the way each subjective person interprets the objective world is very different. No two people think exactly the same about the world, nor can they. This creates a dynamic between us and the world where the world seems like it is something that changes and never stays the same, but instead it's simply how we view it that changes. The only way that the world itself changes is how we contribute to it and create new perspectives. We could change how people see the world, but we cannot change the world itself. Very interesting, Nolan, this last part. We could change how people see the world, but we cannot change the world itself. I wonder, it doesn't follow from me, like, why is it that we cannot change the world? Because it seems like there is ample evidence of the way that the world changed fundamentally, right? Like one example is we used to have something called feudalism. Now we have capitalism. Or that we used to have what's called welfare capitalism, or other people call it like New Deal era capitalism, and now we have neoliberal capitalism. There's a different, like the economy changed fundamentally. So the world has changed. So does it change by itself, or do people change it? So I wanted to kind of pose that question to you. And the other thing that I wanted to kind of say, and you know, I hope you don't take this as I'm picking on you. I'm only picking on you because I thought it was very interesting what you said. So I wanted to respond to it. You said that no two people think exactly the same about the world, nor can they. I think you're right in that people are different, distinct, and no two people are exactly alike, for sure. But part of what we've been talking about, the sociological imagination, though, is that the way that the world is structured creates the conditions in which people respond in similar ways. Or even more, they start to feel in similar ways about certain circumstances. I mean, think about it. excuse me, think about it. Part of the way that we structure our own society is to attempt to get people to feel a certain way at certain times about certain things. So just this past week, we had something called Memorial Day, right? And Memorial Day is about honoring veterans, soldiers who fought. Sorry. It's about Memorial Day is about honoring soldiers who fought in different wars for this country. And honestly, every country, so that what I'm about to say has nothing to do about America per se. Every country has some form of Memorial Day where they honor the soldiers who lost their lives or in wars. The point of those days, of instituting those days, and the creation of all kinds of rituals around them is to get people to feel the same way about something. Is to get everybody to feel a certain way about the soldiers who lost their lives in the war, and to feel a certain way about those wars, and to feel a certain way about how the government acted or went into those wars and those policies, right? It's an attempt to get you to feel a certain way about that thing. Again, this is not about America, Memorial Day, the wars, but it's about the fact that in many ways the structures, how we structure ourselves, is not only about getting us to act in a material way in certain ways, but also about how we feel about certain things. So that so that what I would respond to you, Nolan, or the question I would throw back at you is, no two people are alike, but can two people or more than two people, could thousands of people, feel or think the same way about the world? Isn't that the point of, isn't that one of the main ways that we structure ourselves to try to condition similar responses to certain things? So that's that. Anna says, are we a dynamic society because arguments and premises are also changing? No, we are a dynamic society because, like I said, the agents, that individuals change and structures change accordingly. And because one changes, the other changes. And when the other changes, the first one changes. And they're both constantly changing at all times. That the interaction between the individual and the structure creates that dynamism. Ismail asks or posits, what would we do in a scenario? What would we do in a scenario when we cannot formulate an argument, but we know that the argument of another is false? Do we call them out on having argument that is not sound without knowing if it is false or not? Great question, Ismail. So let's respond to this from a social scientific perspective or from a scholarly perspective, right? So if you see an argument, you do two things. First, question of validity. Two, soundness. So even if you don't know anything about the evidence, if you could show that the argument is invalid, that the logic doesn't follow, then you could say that argument is false. Doesn't matter. The evidence doesn't matter at all. The argument is not valid. So that you could do without knowing anything about the evidence. Now, let's say if the argument is valid, and then you don't know if the evidence is true or false, but you're inclined to believe that it's false. Then I think from a scholarly perspective, then it's incumbent upon you to figure out the evidence. Maybe that's when you have to go and read other people. And if you don't know, if you're not an expert in that subject, then we need to then go and find, well, who are the experts in the subject? And then read what those experts have to say and then come to a conclusion based off of that. Now, we cannot just believe, well, I know this to be false, so I'm just going to run with it. I mean, that could work in your in a non-scholarly fashion. But if we're going to be if we're going to answer this with full integrity, right? If we're going to enter into a conversation with rigor and integrity, then if we don't, then it is incumbent upon us to figure out that evidence, to ask others, to learn, or else then you cannot make the claims that you're making. I cannot make a claim of whether something is true or false if I don't have the evidence on it. The only thing I could say is to say, you know what, I don't have the evidence for this, but there are, I have a strong inclination to believe that there's something fishy here, or it could be false, but I'll get back to you. I got to go read up more. Right? I mean, this happens all the time, I think, in political questions. Maybe theoretically, like you feel like this is wrong. Like maybe, they, for example, in Canada, just recently, they found the remains of 215 kids who were killed in a boarding school. You might not know anything about the history or the politics of the relationship between Canada and its indigenous population, but you could be like, you know what? There's something here that has to do with colonialism and settler colonialism, that Canada is a settler colonial society, and so this is connected somehow to the how these indigenous native kids were killed. But I don't know the full detail, so I got to go find out, right? So I think with validity you don't need to have the evidence. You could just check the logic. But with soundness, you do have to know something about the evidence. And the last question is, I am Panavati, I forget what, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, asks, I am still skeptical about how materialists act upon the world. So I was a bit confused about this, so maybe you could send me an email or respond in the discussion. I just wasn't sure about what you were getting at. What are you skeptical about how the materialists act upon the world? So materialists, I talk about the materialist conditions. When I say materialist, I mean materiality. I mean stuff that's physical, that's empirical, things you could count, see, hear, you could discern with your sensations. The material is everything that is not affective or emotional. That's what I mean by materialist. So I'm not sure necessarily what you were getting at in it, but if you do, I'd love to kind of follow up on it. Okay, so those are the responses to all of the questions you posed in the reading responses and the lecture responses. I hope my responses shed further light into this. Let me know if it didn't. Let me know if you have further questions. Okay, thank you, and I'll looking forward to your the next set of discussions. Thank you all.